The early morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Jasmine checked the time on her phone. Her flight to Seattle would begin boarding in 20 minutes. She took a sip of her coffee and smiled to herself, feeling that mix of tiredness and excitement that comes with travel. After 6 months of late nights and weekend work, Jasmine had finally landed the Henderson account for her marketing firm. Her boss had been thrilled, her team celebrated with cake in the break room, and now she was treating herself to a much-needed vacation to visit her college roommate in Seattle. "This is a boarding announcement for Flight 372 to Seattle. We will begin boarding with our premium and first-class passengers," the voice called over the speakers. Jasmine gathered her carry-on bag and purse. For once, she wasn't flying economy. She had used some of her bonus to upgrade to premium economy with extra legroom. After years of being crammed into middle seats with her knees pressed against the seat in front, she was looking forward to stretching out. When her boarding group was called, Jasmine joined the line, boarding pass and ID ready. The gate agent smiled, scanned her ticket, and wished her a pleasant flight. Walking down the jet bridge, Jasmine felt her excitement building. 6 whole days with no emails, no client calls, and lots of catching up with her old friend. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant greeted as Jasmine stepped onto the plane. Jasmine made her way down the aisle, counting row numbers. 10, 12, 14. There it was. She'd specifically chosen seat 14 when booking, a window seat on the left side of the plane. She checked the seating chart carefully, knowing she'd want to see the mountains as they approached Seattle. She lifted her carry-on into the overhead bin, keeping her book and phone in her purse. Settling into her seat, Jasmine immediately noticed the difference. The premium economy seat was wider, with actual padding, and the legroom was glorious. She stretched her legs out with a contented sigh. As the plane continued to fill, Jasmine pulled out her book, a thriller her brother had recommended months ago that she hadn't had time to start. She sent a quick text to her mom, letting her know she was on the plane, then switched her phone to airplane mode. The middle-aged woman who took the seat across the aisle gave Jasmine a friendly nod. Other passengers filed past, some looking tired, others chatting excitedly. A young couple with a baby settled into the row behind her, and Jasmine silently hoped the little one would sleep during the 5-hour journey. For a moment, Jasmine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This vacation was long overdue. Between the promotion last year and the push for new clients, she'd worked nearly every weekend for months. Her friend had joked on the phone that Jasmine wouldn't even remember how to relax. "Just wait," Jasmine had laughed. "Give me one day by that lake you keep posting pictures of, and I'll be a new woman." Opening her eyes, she gazed out the window at the ground crew loading luggage into the belly of the plane. The sky was clear blue, perfect flying weather. According to the weather app on her phone, Seattle was having an unusually sunny week too. Perfect timing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time, 4 hours and 45 minutes to Seattle. Jasmine opened her book to chapter 1, planning to get lost in the story until takeoff. She barely noticed as the last passengers boarded, her attention caught by the opening lines of her book. It wasn't until she heard a throat clearing beside her that she looked up. A man stood in the aisle, holding his daughter's hand. He was staring at Jasmine's seat with a frown on his face. The little girl, who looked about 8 years old, clutched a small pink backpack and a stuffed unicorn. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying over the ambient noise of the cabin. "I think you might be in our seats." Jasmine looked up from her book and blinked, needing a moment to process what the man had said. He stood in the aisle with his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, both of them staring at her expectantly. "I'm sorry," Jasmine said, placing her bookmark between the pages. "You're in our seats," the man repeated, louder this time. He was tall with neatly combed hair and wore an expensive-looking watch. His navy blue polo shirt had a small logo on the chest, and his khaki pants looked freshly pressed. "We're supposed to be in row 14, seats A and B." The little girl clutched her stuffed unicorn tighter and looked up at her father, then back at Jasmine. "I don't think so," Jasmine replied calmly. She reached for her purse and pulled out her boarding pass. "I'm in 14AC. She held up the ticket so he could see the clearly printed seat assignment. The man, who would later introduce himself as Richard Bennett, frowned and fumbled in his pocket for his own boarding passes. He studied them for a moment, his expression hardening. "We have 14B and 14C, he admitted, showing his tickets. "But I specifically wanted my daughter by the window. She gets anxious on flights, and looking outside helps her." Jasmine gave the little girl a sympathetic smile. The child did look nervous, shifting her weight from one foot to the other and squeezing her unicorn. "I understand, but this is the seat I booked," Jasmine explained. "I specifically chose a window seat for this flight." By now, other passengers were trying to get past them in the narrow aisle. A line was forming, and people were starting to show signs of impatience. Someone a few rows back asked what the holdup was. "Look," Richard said, lowering his voice but keeping his tone firm. "It would be really helpful if you could just move to the aisle seat. My daughter really needs the window. It's not a big deal, right? They're basically the same seats." Jasmine took a deep breath. She had paid extra for this specific seat weeks ago. After working nonstop for months, this vacation was her treat to herself. The window seat wasn't just about the view. It was about having a place to rest her head while she slept on the long flight. "I'm sorry your daughter is anxious," she said kindly, "but these aren't the same seats. I specifically booked the window seat because I need it too. I get motion sickness in the middle and aisle seats." Richard's friendly demeanor slipped. His jaw tightened and he glanced around, as if looking for backup from other passengers. "It's for a child," he said, raising his voice slightly. "Surely you can be accommodating. It's one flight." The little girl looked increasingly uncomfortable, staring at her shoes as her father's voice rose. An elderly couple seated across the aisle exchanged glances. "Sir," Jasmine said, keeping her voice level despite her rising frustration, "I understand your concern for your daughter, but I booked this seat for a reason. Your tickets clearly show you have seats B and C." "This is ridiculous," Richard huffed. He looked at the passengers behind him, who were now openly annoyed at the delay. "I'm just trying to make sure my daughter has a comfortable flight. Why are you being so difficult about this?" A flight attendant noticed the commotion and started making her way toward them from the front of the plane. Meanwhile, Richard's face grew redder. "People like you always make things more complicated than they need to be," he said, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's just common courtesy to give up your seat for a child." Jasmine felt her heart rate quickening. She'd encountered this kind of entitlement before, and the "people like you" comment wasn't lost on her. She straightened her back and looked Richard directly in the eyes. "I have every right to sit in the seat I paid for," she said firmly. "And I'm not going to be bullied out of it." The flight attendant finally reached their row. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Jasmine and Richard. The flight attendant, a woman with short dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, looked between Jasmine and Richard with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name tag read Sophia. "What seems to be the issue here?" she asked, glancing at the growing line of impatient passengers behind Richard. Before Jasmine could explain, Richard jumped in. "My daughter and I are supposed to sit in this row," he said, gesturing to the seats. "I was hoping this lady would be kind enough to switch so my little girl could have the window seat. She gets very anxious during flights." The little girl tugged at her father's sleeve, clearly embarrassed by the attention. "Dad, it's okay," she whispered, but Richard ignored her. "Sir, do you have your boarding passes?" Sophia asked. Richard handed them over with confidence. Sophia examined them and then looked at the seat numbers on the overhead bins. "According to your boarding passes, you and your daughter are assigned seats 14B and 14C, she confirmed, handing the passes back to him. "The middle and aisle seats." "I know what our assigned seats are," Richard said, his voice growing louder. "But my daughter needs the window seat. I'm just asking for a simple courtesy here." He turned back to Jasmine. "I really don't understand why you can't just move over one seat. It's not like I'm asking you to move to the back of the plane." Several passengers nearby stiffened at his poor choice of words. An older black man 3 rows ahead turned around to watch the interaction. Jasmine felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with these subtle digs before, the kind that weren't quite explicit enough to call out, but carried clear implications. "Sir," Sophia interjected, "everyone on this flight booked specific seats for specific reasons. This passenger is entitled to sit in her assigned seat." Look, Richard said, leaning in closer to Sophia and lowering his voice slightly, though not enough that Jasmine couldn't hear. I'm a platinum member with this airline. I fly over 50,000 miles a year with you guys. Surely we can work something out here. My daughter really wants the window. The little girl was now staring at her shoes, her face flushed with embarrassment. She hugged her unicorn tighter and seemed to be fighting back tears. Sophia maintained her professional demeanor. I understand your concern for your daughter, sir, but our seating policy is clear. Each passenger is entitled to their assigned seat. This is ridiculous, Richard huffed. I've never been treated this way on your airline before. He turned back to Jasmine. Why are you being so stubborn about this? It's just a seat swap. Jasmine took a deep breath before responding. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few even recording the interaction discreetly with their phones. I understand your daughter would prefer the window, she said calmly. But I specifically booked this seat weeks ago. I paid extra for it because I get motion sickness in other seats. This wasn't entirely true, but Jasmine felt she shouldn't have to justify her right to sit in her assigned seat. Richard scoffed. Motion sickness? Really? That's your excuse? It's not an excuse, Jasmine replied evenly. And frankly, I don't need to explain why I want to sit in the seat I paid for. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers were growing increasingly uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle caught Jasmine's eye and gave her a small nod of support. Sir, Sophia said firmly, you're holding up the boarding process. I need you to take your assigned seats so other passengers can board. This is outrageous, Richard said, his voice rising again. I want to speak to your supervisor. I've been a loyal customer for years, and this is how I'm treated. Dad, the little girl said quietly, tugging at his sleeve again. Please, let's just sit down. It's okay. Richard looked down at his daughter, then back at Jasmine with undisguised contempt. Fine, he said coldly. We'll take our assigned seats, but I'll be filing a complaint about this. With visible reluctance, Richard guided his daughter into the middle seat and took the aisle seat for himself, muttering under his breath the entire time. The plane finished boarding, and the captain announced they were preparing for takeoff. Jasmine tried to focus on her book, but the words bled together as her mind kept replaying the confrontation. She could feel Richard glaring at her from the aisle seat, his daughter sandwiched uncomfortably between them. As the safety demonstration began, Jasmine noticed the little girl watching with wide eyes, clutching her unicorn tightly. Despite everything, Jasmine felt sorry for her. None of this was the child's fault. First time flying? Jasmine asked the girl softly. The girl shook her head. Fourth time, she whispered back. But I still get scared during takeoff. Before Jasmine could respond, Richard leaned forward. Don't talk to my daughter, he said coldly. Jasmine turned back to her book, cheeks burning. She could hear other passengers shifting uncomfortably around them. The tension in their row was impossible to miss. The plane began to taxi, and Jasmine gazed out the window, watching the ground crew disappear as they headed toward the runway. She tried to recapture her earlier excitement about the trip, but the unpleasant encounter had left a knot in her stomach. This would never have happened if she'd just moved, Richard muttered to an older man across the aisle, loud enough for Jasmine to hear. Some people just love to make a scene. The older man looked uncomfortable and didn't respond, pretending to be absorbed in the in-flight magazine. Dad, the little girl whispered, can I please have my tablet? Richard dug around in his carry-on bag and handed his daughter a tablet in a bright pink case. Here you go, sweetheart. You can watch that movie you like. The little girl put on headphones and tapped the screen, effectively creating a bubble around herself. Jasmine was relieved. At least the child wouldn't have to keep listening to her father's comments. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air. As they climbed, Jasmine caught the little girl sneaking glances at the window. Without thinking, she shifted slightly to give the child a better view. The girl gave her a tiny, grateful smile before quickly looking back at her tablet. About 20 minutes into the flight, Sophia came through the cabin with the drink cart. When she reached their row, she smiled at Jasmine. Would you like something to drink, ma'am? She asked. Just water, please, Jasmine replied. Sophia handed her a cup of ice water and a napkin. Then she turned to Richard and his daughter. And for you too. Ginger ale for my daughter and coffee for me, Richard said without looking up from his phone. As Sophia poured the drinks, Richard continued scrolling through his phone. Then he looked up suddenly. Actually, I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant when you have a moment. Of course, sir. I'll let her know, Sophia said professionally, though Jasmine noticed her smile tighten. After Sophia moved on, Richard turned to the man across the aisle again. You know, it's always the same type of people who refuse to be reasonable, he said, just loud enough for several rows to hear. They always have to make everything about themselves. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around with a frown. Several passengers exchanged glances. The racial undertones in his comments were becoming impossible to ignore. Jasmine took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. She'd faced this kind of veiled language before, in stores when salespeople followed her around, in meetings when her ideas were ignored until a white colleague repeated them, in restaurants when she was seated near the kitchen despite reservations. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, typing quickly. If Richard was going to file a complaint, she would document everything too, every comment, every implication. The little girl tugged at her father's sleeve. Dad, I need to use the bathroom. Richard sighed. Can't you wait until the drink service is done? I really need to go, the girl insisted, squirming in her seat. Fine, Richard said, standing up to let his daughter out. As he moved into the aisle, he deliberately bumped Jasmine's shoulder. Excuse me, he said, not sounding sorry at all. Jasmine watched them walk toward the bathroom. An older black woman across the aisle caught her eye and gave her a knowing look of solidarity. Jasmine nodded back, grateful for the silent support. When Richard and his daughter returned from the bathroom, the drink service had moved to the back of the plane. Richard sat down heavily and immediately pressed the call button. His daughter slipped back into her seat quietly, looking tired and embarrassed by the whole situation. Dad, can we just watch a movie together? She asked, offering him one of her earbuds. In a minute, honey, Richard replied, craning his neck to see if any flight attendant had noticed the call button. Jasmine kept her eyes on her book, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. She could feel the tension radiating from Richard beside her. Part of her wished she had just moved to avoid all this drama, but another part, the part that had faced these small indignities too many times before, refused to give in. About 5 minutes later, a different flight attendant approached their row. She was older than Sophia, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and a pin on her uniform indicating she was the lead flight attendant. Her name tag read Patricia. You called for assistance? Patricia asked, looking at Richard. Yes, Richard said, straightening up in his seat. I'd like to file a formal complaint about how my daughter and I were treated during boarding. Patricia nodded professionally. I can certainly help you with that. What seems to be the problem? Richard launched into his version of events, his voice growing louder with each sentence. My daughter and I were assigned to this row, but not the window seat. I simply asked this woman, he gestured dismissively at Jasmine, if she would mind switching so my child could have the window. She flat out refused, and then your colleague took her side without even trying to help us. Patricia listened carefully, her expression neutral. I see. And these were your assigned seats? The middle and aisle? Well, yes, technically, Richard admitted. But my daughter gets anxious on flights, and looking out the window helps her. I don't think it's too much to ask for another passenger to be accommodating to a child. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to defend herself but decided to let the lead flight attendant handle the situation. Sir, Patricia said calmly, our seating policy is clear. While we appreciate passengers who voluntarily choose to switch seats to help others, no passenger is obligated to give up their assigned seat if they don't wish to. Richard's face reddened. But it's for a child. And I'm a platinum member with this airline. Doesn't that count for anything? Several passengers were now openly watching the interaction. A young man a few rows ahead had his phone tilted in their direction, possibly recording. Your status with our airline is certainly appreciated, Patricia responded, her voice still calm but firm. However, it doesn't entitle you to another passenger's assigned seat. Each passenger selects or is assigned specific seats, often for specific reasons. Richard scoffed. So you're taking her side too? Unbelievable. I'm not taking sides, sir. I'm simply explaining our policy, Patricia replied. Then she turned to Jasmine. "Ma'am, has there been any other issue I should be aware of?" Jasmine hesitated, aware of Richard glaring at her. She chose her words carefully. "There have been some comments made that made me uncomfortable, but I'd prefer not to discuss it right now." Patricia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I see. Would you like me to find you another seat elsewhere on the plane?" The question caught Jasmine off guard. Was the flight attendant suggesting she should move? After standing her ground all this time? Before Jasmine could respond, Patricia added quietly, "There's an empty premium seat in row 8 if you prefer some peace and quiet for the rest of your flight. It's entirely your choice." Jasmine realized Patricia wasn't punishing her. She was offering her an escape from this uncomfortable situation, and an upgrade at that. She glanced at Richard, who was watching the exchange with a smug expression, clearly assuming Jasmine was being relocated because she was the problem. Jasmine took a deep breath. She had a decision to make. Jasmine looked at the lead flight attendant, then at Richard, who was watching with a smug smile, already assuming victory. She thought about moving to the offered premium seat. It would be quieter, more comfortable, away from this unpleasant man and the tension filling their row. But something inside her refused to budge. Why should she be the one to move? She hadn't done anything wrong. "Thank you for the offer," Jasmine said to Patricia, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm going to stay in my assigned seat." Richard's smile vanished. "Are you kidding me? They're offering you a better seat and you're still being difficult." Patricia held up a hand. "Sir, please lower your voice. The passenger has every right to stay in her assigned seat." "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Absolutely ridiculous." Patricia turned back to Jasmine. "Ma'am, if you change your mind at any point during the flight, just let one of us know." Then she looked at Richard. "Sir, if you'd like to file a formal complaint, I can bring you a form to fill out." "Oh, I definitely will," Richard said. "And I'll be contacting customer service as soon as we land. I've never been treated this poorly as a platinum member." Patricia nodded professionally. "That's certainly your right, sir. I'll bring that form to you shortly." As Patricia walked away, Richard turned to the passengers across the aisle. "Can you believe this? All I wanted was a window seat for my daughter." Most passengers avoided making eye contact with him, suddenly very interested in their books or the in-flight magazine. But an older woman across the aisle spoke up. "Actually, I've been watching this whole thing," she said. "That young lady booked a seat fair and square. Your child isn't entitled to it just because you want her to have it." Richard's face flushed red. "Nobody asked for your opinion," he snapped. "And nobody asked for yours, yet you've been sharing it loudly for the past hour," the woman replied calmly before putting on her headphones. A few passengers chuckled quietly. Richard sank back into his seat, fuming. His daughter looked like she wanted to disappear, her small face pinched with embarrassment. Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. She leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Would you like to look out the window for a bit? We're flying over some mountains now." The little girl glanced nervously at her father, who was busy scribbling angrily on the complaint form that Patricia had brought, then nodded. Jasmine shifted slightly to give the girl a better view. "See those peaks with snow on top? Those are the Rocky Mountains." The girl's eyes widened. "They look so tiny from up here," she whispered back. For a few peaceful minutes, Jasmine pointed out different landmarks as they passed. The girl seemed to relax, her earlier anxiety forgotten as she gazed at the landscape below. Richard finally looked up from his form and noticed his daughter leaning toward Jasmine's window. "Emily, sit back in your seat," he said sharply. The girl immediately straightened up. "Sorry, Dad." Jasmine turned back to her book, but she could feel the girl, Emily, stealing glances at the window every few minutes. About 20 minutes later, Sophia returned with a tray. She placed a complimentary glass of wine in front of Jasmine along with a small package of premium snacks. "Courtesy of our first-class cabin," Sophia said with a warm smile. "Patricia wanted you to have this." Richard stared in disbelief. "You're rewarding her behavior?" he asked incredulously. Sophia's smile never wavered. "We're thanking a passenger for her patience and understanding during a difficult situation," she replied smoothly. "Can I get you or your daughter anything else, sir?" Richard shook his head, lips pressed into a thin line. As Sophia moved away, Jasmine noticed several passengers giving her subtle nods or small smiles of support. The woman with the headphones across the aisle gave her a thumbs up. For the first time since boarding, Jasmine felt herself truly relax. She sipped her wine and returned to her book, occasionally shifting to give Emily a better view of the window when Richard wasn't looking. Sometimes standing your ground wasn't just about principle, it was about refusing to let someone else's entitlement dictate your actions. Jasmine had paid for this seat, and she had every right to it. No amount of status or privilege should change that simple fact. The rest of the flight passed more peacefully than Jasmine expected. Richard spent most of the time either writing furiously on his complaint form or speaking in hushed tones on the phone once they reached cruising altitude. He barely spoke to his daughter, who quietly watched movies on her tablet. As they began their descent into Seattle, Jasmine looked out at the stunning view of Puget Sound and the city skyline emerging from beneath scattered clouds. She felt a small tap on her arm and turned to find Emily looking at her hesitantly. "Can I see?" she whispered, gesturing to the window. Jasmine glanced at Richard, who had fallen asleep with his head tilted back and mouth slightly open. She smiled and shifted to let Emily get a better view. "It's beautiful," Emily said softly, eyes wide as she took in the landscape below. "Is that the Space Needle?" "Yes, it is," Jasmine replied. "Have you been to Seattle before?" Emily shook her head. "First time. We're visiting my aunt." She paused, then added in an even quieter voice, "I'm sorry about my dad." The simple apology from this child caught Jasmine off guard. It wasn't Emily's responsibility to apologize for her father's behavior, but the fact that she felt she needed to spoke volumes. "You have nothing to apologize for," Jasmine assured her. "Sometimes adults don't handle things well." Emily nodded knowingly, with a wisdom beyond her years. "He gets mad a lot when he travels. Mom says it's because he feels important at work and gets upset when everyone doesn't treat him special." Before Jasmine could respond, the captain announced they were beginning their final approach. Richard stirred awake, immediately frowning when he saw his daughter leaning toward Jasmine's window. "Emily, I told you to stay in your seat," he said gruffly. The girl quickly pulled back. "Sorry, Dad." The plane landed smoothly, taxiing to the gate as passengers began collecting their belongings. The usual shuffle of people standing too early and reaching for overhead bins began. Richard immediately stood up, pulling his and Emily's bags down and barely acknowledging Jasmine as she waited for her turn to exit. As Jasmine finally stepped into the aisle, Patricia appeared at the front of their section. "Ma'am, could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked Jasmine. "Don't worry about missing your connection. We'll make sure you get where you need to go." Curious, Jasmine followed Patricia to the front of the plane as other passengers disembarked. Richard gave them a suspicious glance as he led Emily past them and off the aircraft. "I wanted to apologize for the difficult situation you experienced today," Patricia said once they had some privacy. "We've documented the entire incident, including the inappropriate comments that were made." "Thank you," Jasmine said, touched by the gesture. "I appreciate how you and Sophia handled everything." Patricia smiled. "We want all our passengers to feel respected and valued. I've added some bonus miles to your account and included a voucher for your next trip." She handed Jasmine an envelope. "I hope this doesn't discourage you from flying with us again." Jasmine was surprised by the airline's response. Too often in similar situations, companies took the path of least resistance or favored higher status customers regardless of their behavior. As Jasmine walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, she spotted Richard at the customer service desk, gesturing dramatically while a calm representative typed on her computer. Emily stood beside him, looking around the airport with curiosity. When she spotted Jasmine, the little girl gave a small wave. Jasmine waved back, hoping Emily would remember this day not for her father's behavior, but as a lesson in standing up for yourself with dignity. 2 weeks later, back home after her Seattle vacation, Jasmine received an email from the airline with a formal apology and confirmation of the bonus miles in her account. Inspired by the experience, she wrote a thoughtful article about standing your ground in the face of entitlement and subtle discrimination. She titled it "The Seat I Paid For" and submitted it to an online magazine where she occasionally contributed. Within days of publication, her article went viral, resonating with thousands of readers who had faced similar situations. Among the many comments and shares, one stood out, a message from a flight attendant who wrote, "Thank you for putting into words what we see every day. Your dignity in that situation taught more than just one little girl a valuable lesson."